morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to be here today to introduce our SGS webinar, How do you design an ESG Sustainability Strategy? Today's webinar will cover a brief introduction into who SGS is, 5 drivers for North America, 5 steps in the organizational cycle, 3 examples of governance bodies, 5 types of benchmarking to inform strategy, how to get started now, and an opportunity for Q&A. My name is Kim LaFrancois, and I'm the Regional Sales Manager for the industrial sector here at SGS. I've been in the testing, inspection, and certification industry for nearly 10 years, working with many different clients throughout various industries. The other speaker joining me today is Adam Hammis. Adam is the ESG Director here at SGS and has 20 years of experience as corporate ESG sustainability consultant, author, and instructor. Adam has founded multiple organizations and has an MBA with international education and leadership experience integrating ESG, CSR, and sustainability into corporate strategy. He has also taken many different courses to become a competent and effective resource for ESG and sustainability. I'll now pass it over to Adam so we can dive right in. Thanks.
Thank you, Kim, and thanks to everyone for being on today. There is a Q&A box that you can type into along the way as for any questions that you have, and so don't be afraid to use that. SGS, if you have not heard of us, we have a global brand. We are the world's leading inspection, verification, testing, and certification company with boots on the ground around the world, and we have been around for 140 plus years. We have sustainability embedded into our company. We have been for a while, from the CEO, from the top to the bottom. I won't spend too much time on these. There's 25 plus years of sustainability experience. We are not new to this. We're actually actively involved in creating and adjusting many of the standards and things that we participate in for our clients. And so we try to be on the forefront of that industry. And we get recognized for our performance year over year. All of the rating agencies that do rate companies like ours rate us very high. And you can look at that. We have an annual sustainability and an annual integrated report as well. So to kick it off, just to get a sense of who's on the call. So one nice question that gives a little information about where you might be in your journey. Does your organization publish an annual ESG or sustainability report? And so go ahead and select the answer. I'll give you a few moments. It's pretty simple. This is a yes or no, and possibly you don't know. And that's all right too. That's actually a common answer. I would select yes for our company, SGS. And it looks like people are submitting now, so I'll give it a few more moments, but appreciate your participation. An annual, financial report is one thing, but an annual ESG or sustainability report does take a little more effort, especially if you've been involved with it. I think you would understand and agree with me that it is not only data collection, but it's the programs as well. You have to have context and storytelling around what those numbers mean. So I'm going to give you about 5 more seconds for the answers because they're starting to slow down, but the majority have responded. So here is our results. The majority have said no, and some have said I don't know, but about quarter have said yes, and that's a really good mix. I think it's becoming far more popular and more common to see those annual reports, but we're going to talk about how to do these things today a little bit. So what are the drivers for ESG and sustainability? They're not the exact same thing, but they're related for North America. And that's because that's my job, and so I can speak more closely to it. Maybe the order would change, but these are the major drivers that we see. One is ESG ratings. That has been around for a while, where all publicly traded companies were started to get ratings and scored on their performance without their say so. They didn't have to voluntarily participate. Any publicly available data, financial analysts and different agencies started to scrub that data and just give you a score, whether you wanted to or not. So that has been around for a while, and those ratings have been used in some decision making by investors and creditors. And so that is one of the the number one for the longer time has been around longer, but that's sort of, it's not new anymore. Where driver number two, it really started to be another large wave into the supply chain, when supply chain customers like large brands started to notice that their scores were not as good because of their supply chain management, and tools came out that allowed them to start looking into their supply chain and having not only visibility but access to their performance, and then starting to either have incentives or disincentives to help their suppliers improve their score, because that's the only way that these larger brands can improve their score. So it's a second wave, EcoVadis and CDP being the most popular, and that really rippled out into smaller privately held companies in a big way, and a lot, maybe not as large a volume of business, but a lot more volume of number of organizations starting to have scores and want to improve their performance. Regulations, I only put this third because we're talking about North America. A lot of companies, especially larger brands, are being impacted by European regulation or Asian regulation or South American regulation. But in the US and Canada, it's very minimal. We're typically around 5 years behind the international scene. Canada doesn't have very strong with teeth. There are some notices and recommendations for things like TCFD, but only recently in the US, there is the federal supplier climate risks and resilience rule that came out. It was announced in November, ratified in January. That's for suppliers to the federal government to report to CDP and create science-based standards, but that's only for, it's a tiered system of very large suppliers first, and then it tiers down. It also has delays in it. So it's not as stringent as some people like to call it, but it does exist now. And there's a proposed US SEC rule change for climate disclosures that's going to take at least another year before that's ratified, if it is. And so regulation is moving the needle, but mostly on only climate change, not ESG broadly, which is environment, social, and governance. And then fourth, and these are much further distance, some of the most progressive companies, they have looked at their consumers, especially if you sell direct to consumers and consumer products. There is a niche market called LOHAS, Lifestyles of Health and Sustainability, that has been consistently growing over the past 2 decades, that now represents $546 billion in global market. And it's about 23% of consumers in the US, and it grows about 10% annually. It won't be 33% next year, but it grows about 10% click. And so those customers are people who are willing to sometimes pay a little bit more, but definitely if there's price parity, that they were willing to choose the socially or responsible or environmentally responsible product over a competitor if there's price parity, and sometimes pay more for that more responsible product as well. And then last, which I think is going to become a continuously growing issue, is the war for talent. This is really focused on more high-skilled positions, but there have been multiple surveys. A 2020, for instance, Unily survey of 2,000 UK-based office workers showed that 83% thought their employer was not doing enough to tackle sustainability and climate change. 65% would prefer working for a company with robust environmental policies. IBM has a much larger survey every year, their Institute of Business Value. They surveyed 16,000 employees in 10 countries, and 67% were more willing to apply for and accept positions with a company they felt was quote unquote sustainable. The issue is that you really need to understand what that means, and sustainable means a lot of different things to different people. So if you know those are the drivers, think about your organization specifically. It's often a mix, but what is your organization's number one driver for considering, or if you already have an ESG and sustainability program, what is your number one driver for ESG and sustainability performance? What's the one that kind of pushes all the rest? There's obviously maybe 1, 2, 3, sometimes there's a little bit of all of them. But what's critical is that you understand your organization and you would create your strategy based on that, because it's a very different strategy if it's just for your employees, and it's a very different strategy if it's just for your ESG rating agencies, or even one ESG rating agency over another. So I'll give you some time. People are starting to submit. Other, You could just say we believe in it passionately and we just think that this is the right way to go, but it's such a broad topic. It's really hard to say we believe in ESG and sustainability because it's made up of dozens and dozens of topics and different KPIs under every topic. So best to get specific and say, who are we trying to make happy? And folks are putting it. I would say our customers for SGS, we work with clients a lot. And so our customers have been demanding this for a long time. That's not the consumer market, we're business to business, but we're not really the audience for this webinar, but I just wanted to share, how we would look at it as we've been serving clients in this space for over 25 years. So I'm going to hit the submit button now, show everybody the results. And this is often what we see. It's a great result. It's a nice balance between everything. Some people have the ratings are maybe dropping a little because that's kind of run its course over the last 5 to 10 years. And employees are not quite as high. And maybe that's hard to just know exactly what your employees care about and what they don't. Sometimes it's a tricky situation to try to make one group of employees happy, but another group doesn't care passionately about that issue at all. So what's important to understand, and it's going to kind of drive everything as well, is this 5-step ESG cycle. And every cycle, I want to back up just a bit because there's a few questions. Will the slide deck be provided? Yes, Susan, thank you. We always provide this slide deck in an email afterwards. Is there any movement among impact investors to fund ESG rated organizations? Typically, impact, yes, is the answer. Impact investors are it depends on how you want to break it down. William, if your impact investor is often, there's like socially responsible investing, which is like a one issue group. Impact investors they actually don't care often. They're usually put in a category that says, we don't even care if we get an ROI, we just want to fund these things that we care about. Socially responsible investing is often associated with 1 or 2 issues, but they do want a return on investment pretty solidly, but it's very simple. It's like one issue, we do or don't invest in this. And then ESG rated funds, they're more complex algorithms, and you have to dive into that and see what are they basing their ESG score on, and are they using something like Sustainalytics, or are they creating their own private custom algorithm based on ESG financial analytics that they use. So it really becomes a question mark of, there's an answer, but yes is the general answer, but how they define an ESG rated organization is often dependent on the agency that's giving you the score and who runs the fund that is selecting the organizations that will be in that fund or not be in that fund. We do have a nice sustainability program, which is the best and fastest way to start working on an ESG certification. I'll talk about that soon, Paula, but there is no best, fastest way. But we can talk about that at the end. There's an ESG certification. Talk about that. Other equals corporate values that drive how we work and operate. Thank you, Amy. That's definitely one. And we just want to, it's hard to put down all those values because it'll depend on what your values are and which environmental, social, and governance issues you choose. The panel listening today is mainly from where, please? USA, Europe, and Africa. Christoph, we're US and Canada, and that's where we're focused on North America. Okay, back to this. The 5-step cycle. This is the appropriate approach that we've worked with thousands and thousands of clients over the years. You need to take these steps. If you don't, you can still have a program, but you do elevate your risk in that program pretty greatly. And you will go through the cycle. Often the first time you go through it can take multiple years. But once you've gone through it, typically, especially if you're creating an annual report, this becomes a once-a-year cycle that you move through. So awareness is the first step. You understand your issues, trends, and strategy. You have to educate yourself, and the group that is making the decisions has to have awareness of the issues. Then you set priorities. Oftentimes it's called the materiality assessment stage, but you have to identify stakeholders. What is your material topics and issues, and are they risks or opportunities or both? And then strategy is the third session. Armed with awareness and all your priorities, then you can create a strategy. You can set a vision, KPIs, goals, plans, all those things before you execute. And that just means you're managing initiatives and projects, doing quality and process improvement, but those have to become set in stone before you can execute, and then basically become business as usual. And then you have a reporting step where you decide when and with who and what you'll communicate. Usually it's either your management approach and your performance. Some people miss the management approach, but those are two of the most common things, your management and your performance. So those steps then can cycle back in. You don't completely wipe the slate clean. You'll just touch base and double check that you're aware of any issues, you're staying relevant and current. Check your priorities. Are the stakeholders the same? Has anything shifted in the marketplace or in the public eye? Globally, COVID-19 was a great example that hit people in a surprise. If you weren't updating your materiality assessment, you're in trouble. You just revisit your strategy. Does anything need to be adjusted? How are things going? And then you go back to execute. And at the end of the year, you report. So those are the steps. Kazumi says risks. We could never possibly list them all today. There are all kinds of risks, Kazumi, but there are different risks at the strategic level of like what business you're in. And then there are key risks in the execution phase, which we'll talk about as well. But just what is inherently risky for energy management versus what is risky for diversity, equity, and inclusion are completely different risks. And so they're topic by topic once you get to execution, but they're very high level strategic risks when you're talking about setting an ESG strategy. These first three, they're color coded because this is an internal leadership activity. The internal leadership sets your strategy. If it's a company-wide strategy, it has to align with your business strategy. And it's an opportunity to do this activity with a little, because there can be sensitive topics with a little bit of insulation from the public. You have difficult conversations. You cover a lot of things, what's going to be included, what's going to be excluded. And this is an internal opportunity to do that quietly with your leadership. Because once you become in the execution phase, all your internal stakeholders, the entire company is going to know about it. Often your business partners are going to know about it because they just see things being done differently, or they hear an announcement that, hey, we're going to change a little bit the way we're doing this. We're going to add something new. We're going to take something away. But then once you get into the reporting step, you are choosing intentionally to create communications, either completely public or specific to different stakeholders that now you're telling the world, and you have to craft specific, careful communications about your performance and your management to key stakeholders. So that's when it gets out there and you have very little control over who ultimately hears that message. And so think of it as a risk management sequence that doing steps 1, 2, and 3 internally manages risk, because you get more risk in step 4 and the most risk once you get into the reporting stage. And because of that, you have different people in different role-based leadership at every step. Technically, the first 3 steps are all the same. We're talking about strategy, and so it's a strategist role. Most often, and I would argue that it almost always should be, some form of senior ESG/sustainability committee. There are different names, but that's what it is. It needs to be a senior committee. It needs to have ties to senior leadership, and it needs to be focused almost wholly on ESG and sustainability, unless your program is not very complex. And then you should really look at maybe you're not choosing enough material topics. But 6 to 8 topics is a good average, and that's a lot of topics to be covered by people. You need a large enough group to handle that. So board, C-suite, VPs, if you have an ESG or sustainability professional dedicated to that role, and also often lead legal counsel to manage that risk. Those are the ones who are in this committee. That's who does the materiality assessment, or at least reviews the results and sets strategy for the company. But when you get into the implementer phase, you're talking about project managers, operational managers, cross-functional SMEs. If it's an energy program, you need an energy expert. If it's a diversity program, you need a diversity expert. And then always risk and quality managers are involved to make sure these initiatives last over time. And last, reporting, you get to the reporter phase. You've got multiple forms of communication, but communications, which is usually internal communications, marketing, which is external communications, but also investor relations, government affairs, and legal compliance, because some of these documents are legally binding, or that you're putting them out to government agencies or investors who have very specific rules that they need you to follow. And so it's different people who will get not only training, but expectations put on them for involvement in the ESG program. So all of that being said, what is your role and what step of the ESG sustainability cycle fits strongest with you? Do you see that you are a senior leader who needs to sit on a senior ESG committee? Or are you sometimes if you're the ESG professional, like a director of sustainability or something, you might be on all three of these, but you're probably going to be stronger as like a coordinator of the three. But you could consider yourself a strategist. Implementer is you work in a department, you have ownership over maybe one of the departments that is owning a key responsibility, like a waste management program, and you're in facilities. And you're being asked to track data specifically on one topic or two topics that are reported. Or if you're a reporter, are you really putting that report together at the end, collecting the data, making sure that it's reviewed, making sure that maybe you're a graphic designer and website designer, you're putting a really cool web-based portal for the company. But these are different groups, so where does your role fit? And try to identify yourself as one of the three. I see them coming in quickly, so I'll give it a few more moments. If you've never been in the room and seen a materiality assessment, that's usually that's a strategist thing. If you're not managing a particular initiative, you might not be an implementer. If you've never worked on the report, if you just passed data to somebody and they worked on the report, that's a good sign that you're not the reporter. Just things like that. But we're going to hit go. And this is good. This is kind of what I expect. I wish we had a few more implementers and reporters, definitely reporters, in these kind of webinars. But it tends to be the strategists who start out. But it is really important that implementers and reporters know some of this basic information as well, because there's some risk involved if they don't. They might not understand why they're being asked to do certain things, and not cut corners, but just not do it the way that it was expected. So I think it's just shot up one slide that I didn't know if I was skipping over something. So let's talk about, and it's very important, if you're going to create an ESG or sustainability strategy, make sure you're the one creating it. So you shouldn't have somebody who's in the weeds, like a health and safety person, creating their own ESG strategy for the whole company. It just isn't realistic. It's not going to be implemented. It's not going to be adopted with any authority. And so what are these governance activities in the ESG realm? Governance is often overlooked, but governance is really the identifying and prioritizing of material issues. What are our most important and most relevant to the business environmental issues? What are the most important and relevant social issues? What are the most relevant governance issues? That's how you can set your vision and goals. That's how you adopt strategy and policies to achieve those goals. That's why it needs to be at a governance level. And then you also are a leader who allocates people and resources, because you have to have people and resources in place to enact policies and strategies. So that's why we really talk about this at a senior ESG level. If you talk about it from the KPI session, I just throw this up here. They're really not KPI. Most of the KPIs in the governance are more of a checkbox. There are only a few that are tracked over time as a continuous process improvement. They're more of, do you have an appropriate structure in place? What are some details about the nomination process, selection process, qualifications, conflict of interest policies, remuneration, risk management, safety management, legal compliance, annual total compensation ratio. That's something that can be tracked over time. Fines and settlements related to ESG issues, incidents. There's a few here that can become KPIs and that can show year over year or month over month improvement. But the majority of governance topics are about what's been put in place from a governance standpoint to manage effectively environmental, social, and governance issues, And are they the most material issues, and how did you decide? So it's a lot of more context than KPIs. And the governance structure, that why I say it needs to be in place, it mirrors your typical hierarchy of an organization. If you think of, especially if you're publicly traded, if you have a board of directors, you'll have a senior executive team, that's the C-suite. You'll have departmental leadership, often your VPs, maybe some directors, middle management, operational specialists, frontline workers. It's pretty generic. What I'm going to show you is this is how they pull governance structures in place. There's more than one opportunity to have it besides the senior team, but often you'll have an audit committee. If you're a publicly traded company, they want your ESG program to be looked at least reviewed by your formal audit committee that includes board of directors. If you're not public, you don't have to worry about that often. If your senior ESG committee, that's going to be, it could include the board if you're public, if you have a board of directors, but it definitely needs to have some senior executives on the team as well as your departmental leadership. Often that departmental leadership is pulled directly from key departments that manage one or more of your material issues. It's really almost unheard of that the HR department is not included because of social issues and talent management and people. But when it gets to environmental, it can be a lot of different things because you might be facilities, might be operations, it might be supply chain. And so it does depend on who ends up being on that committee, depends on some of your material issues. And then you'll hear other things that are further down. They're more implementer groups. It could be called sustainability working groups or green teams. These are not senior level, board level people. These are, once you have your material topics established, these groups get established to make sure that there's cross-departmental communication or that things keep moving forward, because a lot of these issues are not isolated and siloed into one department. Okay. So last thing I'll say about this is where you often see that dedicated ESG or sustainability professional. They're up here on that senior ESG committee, but they often also coordinate between the sustainability working group and the green teams. The dedicated ESG professional is typically the one who has to know what everybody's doing. They're the jack of all trades that has to go, or Jill of all trades, that has to be really in the know about everything that's happening so that they can also usually review the sustainability or ESG report at the end of the year and make sure that it all works well together. Some pretty close. So I'm going to answer some questions that came in. They're really good. Chris, is this pretty closely tied with an ISO 14001 management system? No, Chris. ISO 14001 is a great example of one environmental management system. So it's something in the weeds down here, like a green team or a sustainability working group, but it completely leaves out the social and the governance issue. So that's more of a lower level implementer management system. And then Angela says, how many of the governance topics are relevant to family-owned companies? There's no right answer, Angela, but I will say that the family-owned companies, especially if you take away the private ownership, it's really more selective. You don't have any legal requirements to, but if you want to meet some standards like GRI, SASB, sometimes you will selectively volunteer some of that information if you feel it's not a competitive advantage to keep it just undisclosed. But they're great KPIs to review, and that's really up to you. I think what it comes from, the answer to all of these questions is, do you have any key stakeholders that believe it should be relevant or they believe it should be disclosed, and that's who you want to disclose to? That's part of this materiality assessment piece that we'll talk about, but that's who determines which ones are relevant or not. But you can read through those lists. Those are publicly available. Angela, if you go to download GRI or download the SASB industry standard that's for your industry, you can read exactly which KPIs and how to measure them, and you can decide if it's something you want to do. And there's a reference list of standards we should be familiar with as a dedicated ESG sustainability management consultant. Marianne, I mean, yes, but if they're ESG level, you're talking about the UN SDGs, GRI, SASB, probably integrated reporting, and there's another one like the WRI. Actually, you can forget that one. I don't think it's nearly as good. But those are high level. Once you actually determine your strategy and which material topics you have, then you get the fun act of learning which standards exist per environmental topic or per social topic, because there are more implementation standards, but then these reporting standards like GRI, SASB, the UN SDGs, integrated reporting, things like that, those are high level ESG standards for reporting. And so you need to kind of know all of it, but I would do the big ones first. And then once you identify your material topics, you can move on to the topic specific standards that you want to know. Here is an example of a governance structure. I'm going to show you three. This is CNHI. This is all publicly available data, but if you look at their report, they're a public company. They're in the ag equipment industry. They have their board of directors, and they've shown quite a bit of detail. They have an audit committee, which is typical. They have their human capital and compensation committee, which doesn't have a direct line written to anybody, but you can understand that a lot of social issues with talent management would be here as well. And then they have an environmental, social, and governance committee at the board and executive level. And you can see how the CEO is the go-between on the senior leadership team. But they still have a global compliance and ethics committee that is directly tied to the audit committee, so they consider ESG issues. And then they have the sustainability steering committee, which also includes this chief diversity and inclusion, sustainability and transformation officer. You can see that they've, which I don't always recommend, they've thrown 1, 2, 3 different terms in here that all could mean very different things. And hopefully that person is dedicated to only some of the most important material topics, but the CEO is there as well, tying this together. So that's one example of a fairly large publicly traded ag equipment company. And then if we go to another example, ADM, this is another large public company, but they're in food processing. They've got their Sustainability and Corporate Responsibility Committee of the board, just one at the board level. They have their executive council is what they call it, which you can imagine is probably their 1 or 2 board member representatives and then their senior VPs. It's a C-suite. And then here you've got one VP, Chief Sustainability Officer. So a dedicated professional who probably has oversight over some key issues and reporting. And then they have regional and corporate teams. And we would expect that most of these teams, plural, are specific to whatever material topics that they're working on. It's not just a generic ESG team. It's probably an energy team or a waste team or anything like that, water team for each different topic. And then we have a private company, and this is Monlick Healthcare, which is private in the medical solutions world. They just give more of a descriptive piece. So they talk about accountabilities at the board level, and then they give a contextual paragraph about everything that the board does and how the owner investors are involved with an audit committee, and you can read some of these things. Then they have an executive leadership team when they describe who is on that. They have a global compliance committee as well, and who is involved in that. For example, the chief compliance officer. Then they have sustainability functions, which are those more material topics, and a sustainability committee that oversees some of these key things. And then each business area, they've identified wound care, operating room solutions, gloves, and antiseptics as 4 key areas of the business that they need to focus on. And then they have some governance conversation here just about strategy and operations. It's more about how it integrates into their already existing business value proposition. So even a private company is here with a fairly similar example of a structure. Before I go, well, actually, let's just do this question and then I will come back. So has your organization established a senior ESG/sustainability governance body? Yes, no, or I don't know. This should be a pretty easy one. Again, though, sometimes like a sustainability or an ESG report, you might not know, especially if you're at the implementer phase. I think you would have to see it in an announcement, or typically if you're in the reporting phase, you have heard about it because that's the group that's telling you to put together the report. But if you're an implementer, don't be surprised. Oftentimes you wouldn't know the exact structure for governance of the issues. And I promise I'll got a couple more good questions. So I'll come right back to those when this is finished. All right, I'll give it a few more moments because I see it slowing down. We answered yes, that we do. And so we have yes, about a quarter, a little over half say no, and 15% says I don't know. Very typical. It is something to look at if you're an I don't know, and if you're a no, You can look at why not, and I would suggest that that's one of the critical pieces. What often happens, which slows down your program, is if you ask lower level employees who don't have the authority to create an ESG strategy and then try to push it uphill into leadership. It is very difficult to do, and almost never works. And usually you'll spend a year or two, and then you'll eventually go creating a senior ESG sustainability governance body anyway. So try to save yourself a year or two. And the only question I would ask you is, if you have a governance body that is a senior ESG sustainability focus, seeing some of the examples that we put in, is it the right assignment? Are the right people on there? Is it the right structure? Does it live in the right place? And is it assigned the right leaders for success based on your priority material issues? So I'm going to jump to a couple questions just since they're here. So Peter says, do you need to have specific frameworks in mind before conducting a materiality assessment? Great job, Peter. I'll answer that in a second, but no. Does SGS perform a gap analysis for ESG strategy against the SEC proposed rules? Yes, Frederick, and we'll talk about that too. The SEC proposed rules, I probably shouldn't say this. I've been in this industry for a long time. There's charts out there. They're not that strict. They're going to take a while to implement, and they're delayed in court. But what a lot of people don't differentiate between is that they're not even environmental, they're just climate. It's a climate disclosure rule. It is not an ESG ruling. It is not an environmental, social, or governance. It's one topic in a category of environmental. And so they're very specific to one thing. And it's very common, it's very popular, it's a very important topic. But you can do a materiality assessment as well. And it says, Christoph says, why are you not talking about ISO 26000? It's a great standard. It's called social accountability, Christoph. It does have some other broader issues, but you don't need ISO 26000. And my answer to you, which is a great question, is ISO 26000 is not very popular in the United States and Canada. I'm not saying no one does it, but when we look at a global scale, SA 8000 and ISO 26000 are just not as common. Not that we've even done a couple, but they haven't gotten adopted very much. And so you can do these things, including a materiality assessment, which I'll talk about, and not be ISO 26000. We also can't certify to it. We can just do a review. It's not a certifiable standard. It's a guidance standard. You can notice the 0 on the end. If there was a 1, that would mean we could produce a certificate that's certifiable and accredited. So these are all great questions. Thank you. So 3 aspects of your strategy you need to assess. And I would say you just need to look at to create. What are we prioritizing? Is it the right stuff? How are we doing today? Who should we be benchmarking against? Where do we sit in the pack? And then what's our capacity? How are we going to improve over time? Because there's only one reason to measure things. It's either to maintain good performance or to improve not good performance. So we'll talk about each of them. This is when we talk about material topics. You might be very familiar with an image like this. These are all of the GRI topics, all these little abbreviations in here. But it's an example that it just says, there are so many framework standards, ESG rating agencies, stakeholders. Just know that you should not try, and you will never make everyone happy. So material topics are the most relevant topics for your industry, for your business specifically. And they definitely have to be impacting the business. And some people do double materiality, which means business impacting the planet and society. That is more of an ESG sustainability difference. Impacting the business is an ESG. It's business material, it's financially material. And then business impacting the planet and society, that's what's called double materiality. What's your impact on the world around you? Identifying material topics requires both benchmarking and stakeholder identification, assessment, and engagement. So what you see when you see a chart like this is what you are assuming is they have identified their key stakeholders, they have assessed those stakeholders, and they've gone out and spoken to a certain group of them with an engagement process, and they have gotten rankings on all of these important topics and found out we're going to focus on these ones at the top right because they scored highly on impact to the business and importance to stakeholders. And this not means they're not going to do anything with these others, but you can't have an ESG, you can't have an effective ESG or sustainability strategy that has 36 topics. It's just not, it's unrealistic, and it's not, you can consider greenwashing for the most part. You want to have what are your most important things that you're going to do really well in, and then you want to have these shored up. You don't want to have any terrible non-compliance issues, but it's not important. I often say, if you have a food manufacturing plant that goes through 1 million gallons of water per day, who doesn't talk about water, that's a red flag. But if you have an office building that has 3 bathrooms and they say water is their most important thing, then that's a red flag, because those are not all issues are most relevant to each company. And so you have to understand what's material and what isn't. And so that's what we're talking about by material topics. And how do you discover that? There's at least 5 things that you look at. And this is what, you said SGS, Friedrich, you asked about SGS. I would say any third party that's going to do a materiality assessment should have the majority of these things, unless you have decided you don't want to, you want to pay a little less, or you want to prioritize some of these. But any materiality assessment will look at regulations, because country by country, region by region, regulations differ. And ideally, you would probably want to go with the most strict regulations, or you're going to have to create a separate system for the European Union than you do for the United States, and that's up to you to manage that separately, but it does produce risk. So looking at those regulations and what you're required to do by law. Then you look at ESG ratings, and this used to be only for publicly traded companies. Now there's things like EcoVadis, CDP, producing rankings for either EcoVadis is a cross company, and a lot of privately held companies are in the system, or CDP, which is only climate. And so it's useful, but it's only a climate related score. But if you need to know, and you can talk to your investor community, or you can decide if you're in the EcoVadis system and stakeholders care about that. But you need to choose some of these if they are relevant. You can exclude them if they're not, but you need to understand what each of them and their methodology and how you're scored and why you're scored. And that will help you create an effective strategy. You don't have to make everybody happy, but identifying which agencies are relevant to you helps you very easily see what they think is material. And then standards. We talked about this before, but GRI, SASB, UN Sustainable Development Goals, integrated reporting. I throw TCFD up here. It's only a climate change standard, but it is it's one of the most popularly adopted, I would say, frameworks. It's not a standard, I apologize, but it's regulation often just references TCFD specifically because it's 4 categories. It is not prescriptive as far as specific KPIs that you have to put in, but it does say, here's a framework to use. And so I throw it in there because it's popular internationally as a framework, although it's not technically a standard. And then if none of those are relevant to you, you can just say, okay, we're not going to worry about those standards, but you do need to look at them. And then competitors. You're running a business, and so it doesn't do a lot of good, especially if you're trying to build your brand value, to not look at what your peers are doing, because if you align with the regulations, ratings, and standards, and then you come out with a great report, but you didn't notice that you're losing in the whole pack of peers, then you didn't maximize the value out of that report. And maybe you don't want to put out a great report that focuses and tells everybody that you're at the back of the industry. And so competitor benchmarking is very important. And then stakeholder engagement is the process that you really should go through, because once you identify other stakeholders, these include those regulatory bodies, but they can include business partners that have a really strong influence over what you're able to do. They could be industry associations. It could be media, depending on what industry you're in. There could be specific watchdog organizations that you need to understand. Stakeholder engagement is a process you go through, but the end result is different for every company. It's very specific to you and what's important and who has influence and impact on your company. And getting that feedback from them does include risk. So you want to manage the process appropriately and carefully, but it is incredibly valuable information that helps you in a fine-tuned way, create a very specific strategy that's going to make your stakeholders happy and not just try to make everyone happy or, you know, whatever, just do something that's popular at the time, but is not going to last as a strategy for your business. It needs to be a very solid, durable strategy that you can track over time, because people want to see year-over-year results in most of these categories. So those are the 5 most important parts of a formal materiality assessment that you're benchmarking against very specific things and very different things. And actual performance is something that you will need to get to. So we often see, especially here's an example of like a peer comparison. You do need to know how you're doing and where you sit. Are you a laggard? Are you middle of the pack? Are you top of the field? And then you can say all these questions tie into that senior ESG committee saying, what does our strategy need to look like? And if you don't ask yourself these questions, your strategy is not going to be as effective and successful as it could have been. Are we in compliance with regulations? Are we performing adequately for our investors? Are we performing adequately for our customers? How do we compare to our industries? And how are we doing in the eyes of other key stakeholders? Internal capacity. What are the right long-term targets? Can we maintain any good standing? Can we improve any poor performance? Have we assigned qualified leadership to these issues? Have we allocated adequate resources? This comes down to your ESG committee might say, someone says, hey, this is great, I participated. Clearly, I'm not the right person. I think, you know, Beth over in HR should take my position because my role in the company is not overseeing a material issue. You know, let's readjust the senior committee. Or have we allocated resources? Like, hey, let's not set too aggressive goals in the first year because we already did all of our budgeting, you know, 6 months ago. We shouldn't say we're going to do a bunch of great things when we can't change our trajectory until, you know, June of next year. You've got to be realistic about what kind of resources you have available to the company. Peter says, should companies large and small engage rating agencies, or can they be done further down the road? Peter, great question. I wouldn't engage, if a rating agency has engaged you as far as giving you a score, then absolutely participate in that engagement because you're already given a score. However, this is my caveat. If you talk to every stakeholder and every investor and none of them mention that rating or that scoring, or your bank has never once said, we really care about the, you know, there's MSCI, ISS, there's a Sustainalytics, EcoVadis, there's several of them. You don't have to engage. If an agency gives you a score, especially if it's some agency you've never heard of, there's only 4 or 5 that have a lot of reputation in the marketplace. You only engage them if they're relevant to you or to your stakeholders. Otherwise, you will chase countless amounts of things and have to fill out so many different issues. Part of a good materiality assessment is identifying which rating agencies are material and only engaging with them. Naturally, if you improve in one rating agency, you can expect that your other scores will improve, but they're not all the same. But you don't need to worry about, I'll keep coming back to this mantra, don't try to make everybody happy. Find out the most important groups and make them happy. And then further down the road, if you're private and no one's ever scored you, there's not a real, unless some creditor or investor is demanding that you have a score from an agency, it's a very ad hoc process. Not a lot of private companies get a score from like MSCI. You have to go request it and they ask you why, and they'll put you in the queue and maybe they'll give you a score. It can be done, but you really don't do that much work if it's not absolutely necessary and critical to your strategy. So has your organization conducted a formal materiality assessment? Yes, no, and I don't know is a perfectly valid answer. One quick tip is if you see that matrix with kind of bottom left to top right angle of which issues are on a matrix from impact to the business and importance to stakeholders, if you see that chart in your business, odds are there's a yes, because that is the product of a materiality assessment. It may not have been that robust, but you could say yes for that reason alone. If you've never seen that matrix, it doesn't mean that you have not done a materiality assessment, but it's a good rule of thumb to say, hey, maybe we haven't done one. I've never seen a matrix with all of our material issues shown. It's not the only answer, but it's a great indicator whether you have it or not. We have one. And sometimes, to be honest, you'll see them in the first 2 or 3 years when a company does the report. I've seen companies decide, hey, I think people know what our program is and why it exists, and they'll pull it back and have it, available by request, but it saves them 2 pages sometimes in a report. And then I say that, and on the other hand, GRI, if you want to be a GRI compliant report, you can't pull it out of your report. You have to have it somewhere publicly available. Otherwise, you don't have a GRI compliant report. So all these fun things, but I do see a lot of people submitting, and I'll give you just a moment and then I'll hit yes. And then Christoph, I'll get to your company or your question shortly. So here are the answers. Most folks are no, a few yeses, and some I don't knows, which is very common, especially if you're a privately held company. If you've not got into the GRI world, GRI reporting, that's a mandatory aspect of it. So this is not unheard of. I would tell people that when people say it's not required, that is grossly underestimating the insane amount of business value that you get from a materiality assessment, including the stakeholder engagement. If you actually go out and do a formal stakeholder engagement process, all of the questions that people say, I don't know, should we do this? Should we do that? If leadership is not confident, they're like, oh, I'm not really sure. We chose this one, but I wasn't very confident. It's usually because you didn't do a materiality assessment. The materiality assessment is so much detail, and it gives you the confidence in why you're choosing some things and why you're excluding other things. I can't say enough about the value. However, if it's expensive, you can try to stair step it in and do, one form of benchmarking that 1 year and kind of like stair step it in year over year. But the results of a materiality assessment are where the confidence in your program come from, because it's the most amount of detail and feedback from key stakeholders that are actually relevant to your business comes from. And then Christoph, great question. To have studied a construction company report, sometimes the materiality is done internally without real study based on feeling. That is accurate. I would say materiality, especially because the term comes from the financial movement, the financial world of reporting. When you say materiality, it implies that you've done your homework. And some people relate to ESG and sustainability as sort of soft, feel-good stuff, and they've treated it very loose, and they've used language that's very questionable for a very long time. And so it's not like it's a problem that it happens, but now that it's gaining a lot more standing especially in the publicly traded sphere and from investors and creditors and financial institutions, it is becoming a problem, and some regulation is really cracking down on things in the term of greenwashing, and materiality is one of those issues. Is if you say materiality, it's a financial term that means this is material to your business and therefore should be backed up with research, and investors and creditors are making business decisions, buy, sell decisions, or loan, not loan decisions based on it. So the risk of saying materiality, but you really just picked the 6 things that you cared about the most, is increasing exponentially every day, because materiality is a financial term. So just know that that's where it comes from, and it really should be done with some level of robustness to cover the risk that is inherent. Or just don't say materiality. Just be honest and say, this matches our company values. We don't have any strong regulatory pressure to do anything, so we've chosen to do these 7 or 8 things. There's no inherent legal risk in that, but people will compare you to others and to your peers and competitors, and they might say, well, this competitor did it, and they came up with very different topics than you, and they're providing KPIs on these, and they seem important. So it's something to really think about, but it is not. You will find out through your own assessment whether it's legally required or not, or if it's required from a reporting standard. But it is. I would just say, be careful and manage risk. Peter says, do you have specific partners in the software space with you, or has there been a solution you feel has been particularly interesting in assisting with an ESG strategy? No, I would not say, whoops. Well, the first answer is we have software in specific areas. Like we have this transparency one, which is a supply chain transparency software, but that's not a broad ESG software. And I would say no, and one is because we're third party and we try to be independent or agnostic. We work with lots of softwares, but we don't have one ourselves. And the softwares that I will say personally, this is my opinion, the softwares that work the best are tailored to your industry, because a software that actually, even if it took GRI, for example, GRI is like the biggest of, it's everything in the kitchen sink. It's way more than you ever want to use. It's the whole sandbox, but you have to use materiality, and then you only look at very specific parts of GRI when you get to the actual KPIs. But if you try to create a software that had everything of GRI included from a strategy standpoint, you would have to create a very expensive software. And every time somebody used it, 85% of the software would not be relevant to them. And that's why it typically doesn't work very well. There's usually good software that is, industry specific, and usually an industry association might be familiar with your industry and tell you, hey, here's some softwares that we like, or they might have even participated in the creation of some of that software. So that's where I would direct you to. And we think, what we do, which is I'll talk about next, we have what's called an ESG Health Check. It's really customizable. We go down to like a very small, like a one-day audit for a small company, and it just gives you, here's the material topics if you're really trying to cut cost. But we can layer in gap analysis. We look at regulatory. We don't do a full, I have to stop short. We can do a very comprehensive, what I would call double materiality assessment, but we're an audit company and we do a lot of evaluative things that are very defined. We always exclude actual stakeholder engagement, because you have to get a consultant who is willing to flex with you. It can take 6 weeks to 6 months. It depends on who your stakeholders are, but you have to have a customized approach. You should have a customized approach to every stakeholder, depending on your relationship to them, who they are, and then engage with them in the manner appropriate to that relationship. And therefore, for us, who we schedule things like audits on a very defined basis, we're just not set up to go out and kind of just be on call for 6 months to a year and see what happens. So we always exclude the actual engagement piece, but there are people that we know we can recommend that do the engagement, but we can do everything else. And we can scale it as robust and as kind of narrow as you need it. And we can stair step with you year over year if you want to. We call it the ESG Health Check, but it can basically add on more and more complexity over time. So you can always reach out about that. We do have great training. I would say folks who want to do it themselves but feel like they just want to be trained, we have a foundation course, which is now on demand. It's a prerequisite for all the others, but then you can take ESG strategy, and you can see that they're aligned specifically to the strategist, the ESG senior leaders. We have an implementation course, which is more the project management over time course for specific ESG topics. And then we have ESG communications, which is really for those reporters who have legal, stakeholder, or just communications responsibilities in putting out not only an annual report, but any other kind of communications. We're talking about greenwashing a lot here. We offer them regularly, but the next ones are in May, 16th, 17th, and 18th. That, like I said, the on-demand course, which is the prereq, is available at any time. And I think there's going to be links in the section. You have like a resources box on the right-hand side of your screen if you want. But to wrap it all up, how do you create an ESG sustainability strategy? Well, one, I would say you have to have at least the start of a governance body, a senior governance body. Do you have a board of directors? What senior executives need to be on it? Is there a dedicated ESG role? Consider legal counsel or somebody in risk management. You've got to have senior level visibility to that level of decision making. And then I will stop you short here. Consider that 5-step cycle. There's awareness, so you might get some training and research. Do a materiality assessment. That's where you're in the priorities step, and then create that strategy. And it's really customizing a strategy that fits your material topics. and the results of your materiality assessment. And then at least consider these 5 benchmarking types: regulations, ratings, standards. I should throw frameworks in there too, but often they're referred to as standards, competition, and then stakeholder engagement. And that's who, what, and how that's where your ESG and sustainability strategy needs to come from for it to be what I would say excellent and successful. There's a lot of risk in leaving any of these things out, not only financially, legally, but just inherently of not getting good results of what you're hoping for. And then I would say thank you and hand it off to Kim. And then are there any other questions?
Thanks so much, Adam. It looks like that's all we have time for today, but please don't hesitate to reach out to me or Adam directly if we can be of any help. Thank you, Adam, for all of this wonderful information, and thank you all for your time. Have a great day.